"You don't belong in this courtroom," my mother-in-law said, loud enough for the back row to hear. "You're just a bitter ex-wife, pretending paperwork makes you important." My ex-husband, Mark, sat beside her and looked down at his hands. I did not answer. I only rested my fingers on the worn leather case beside me, the one with the faded JAG insignia pressed into the corner. Then the retired judge in the second row stopped moving. His face changed the moment he saw my name on the file. "Captain Donovan," he said quietly. My mother-in-law smiled like she had already won. She had no idea the case she mocked had once carried her family name. "My name is Claire Donovan. I was 42 years old that day, and for most of my adult life, I had learned how to sit quietly while other people rewrote my story. I spent 12 years in the military as a JAG officer. Most people hear the word military and picture uniforms, helicopters, or combat deployments. They do not picture courtrooms. But courtrooms were where I served. I prosecuted military crimes, fraud, abuse of authority, evidence tampering. Cases that ruined careers and changed lives. Some of those investigations took years. Some of them followed me home long after the files were closed. And almost none of them were things I could discuss at family dinners, especially not with Eleanor Whitaker. My former mother-in-law had spent the entire marriage trying to reduce me into something smaller than I was. If I worked late, she called me selfish. If I stayed quiet, she called me weak. If I refused to discuss my cases, she assumed there was nothing worth discussing. Claire just did paperwork. She liked telling people. The strange thing was that Mark never corrected her. Not once. For years, I convinced myself he was trying to keep peace in the family. Later, I realized peace and silence were not always the same thing. Sometimes, silence was simply surrender. Our marriage did not collapse because of one argument. It collapsed because I spent years standing alone while the people closest to me watched. After the divorce, Eleanor became worse. She told relatives I had exaggerated my military career. She hinted that I was using my veteran status for sympathy. At one family gathering, I overheard her laughing with a neighbor. "People hear military and think she's some kind of hero," she said. She pushed paper behind a desk. I remember gripping my coffee cup so tightly, my hand hurt. Not because she was wrong, because she never cared enough to ask. Back in my apartment, I opened a small wooden box I rarely touched. Inside were my service medals. Beneath them sat my retired JAG credentials. And underneath those was an old case patch marked Raven Ledger. I stared at it for a long time. 3 weeks later, Eleanor filed a lawsuit, and for the first time in years, I would be sitting in a courtroom again. Only this time, I would not be the prosecutor. The courtroom was smaller than the ones I used to work in. Dark wood, beige walls, the steady hum of the air conditioning overhead. Yet, somehow, it felt harder to sit in. When I had worn a uniform, I knew exactly where I belonged. That morning, I was simply Claire Donovan, the woman being sued by her former mother-in-law. Eleanor arrived 15 minutes early. She wore a cream-colored suit and the kind of smile people use when they think they have already won. Several relatives sat behind her. A few nodded when she entered. One even patted her shoulder. The sympathy in the room was pointed in only one direction. It wasn't mine. Mark walked in a few minutes later. For a moment, I thought he might sit beside me. Instead, he took the empty chair next to his mother. The choice was small. The message wasn't, I looked away before he could see the disappointment on my face. The hearing began. Eleanor's attorney stood first. He spoke confidently about damaged reputations, emotional distress, and false accusations. Then, Eleanor was invited to speak. She didn't hesitate. Claire has spent years pretending she was some kind of military hero, she said. A few people shifted in their seats. She continued. The truth is, she pushed paperwork behind a desk and now expects everyone to be impressed by it. A couple of quiet laughs escaped from the back row. Eleanor heard them. That encouraged her. Honestly, she added, she acts like she ran military operations. She filed forms. The laughter grew slightly louder. I remained still. People often mistake silence for surrender. The military taught me otherwise. I placed my leather case on the table and opened it to retrieve a document. For only a second, the contents became visible. An old mission patch, a retired JAG credential, several sealed case records. The patch carried a black raven against a silver shield. Raven Ledger. I barely noticed it, but someone else did. Judge Harlan Price, seated among the observers, suddenly leaned forward. His expression changed, not curiosity, recognition. He stared directly at the patch, then at me, then back at the patch. The color slowly drained from his face. Across the room, Eleanor kept speaking, unaware. The judge's eyes never left the table. Finally, I saw him remove his glasses. His hand trembled slightly. And under his breath, so quietly that almost nobody heard it, he said 4 words. That case was sealed. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter after Judge Price spoke. Even Eleanor stopped talking for a moment. The presiding judge looked toward the gallery. Judge Price, he asked, did you say something? The retired judge slowly stood. He was well into his 70s now, but there was still authority in the way he carried himself. I apologize, Your Honor, he said, but I believe I recognize one of the documents on that table. The room shifted. Eleanor frowned. Her attorney looked irritated. The judge granted Judge Price permission to speak. Price turned toward me. For a second, I was no longer sitting in a county courthouse. I was standing in a military courtroom 15 years earlier. The same steady eyes, the same careful attention to facts. Captain Claire Donovan, he said. Former judge, Advocate General Corps prosecutor. A murmur moved through the room. I heard someone whisper behind me. Captain, Eleanor laughed nervously. There must be some misunderstanding. There is not, Judge Price replied. His voice remained calm. That somehow made it stronger. I presided over portions of the Raven Ledger proceedings. The laughter disappeared. Every bit of it. Judge Price looked towards the patch on my table. That was one of the most sensitive military investigations I encountered during my career. I lowered my eyes briefly. I never enjoyed talking about Raven Ledger, not because I was ashamed. Because some victories come with a cost. The memory returned anyway. Fort Bragg, a cold night, heavy rain striking the windows of an administrative building. A young soldier had died after defective equipment failed during a training exercise. Official reports blamed the soldier. The evidence said otherwise. Powerful people wanted the file closed. They wanted a grieving family to accept a lie. I was the prosecutor assigned to the case. When witnesses disappeared and records were altered, I refused to sign off. The investigation continued. Months later, the truth surfaced. The soldier had been failed long before the accident. I never spoke publicly about the case because the family deserved privacy more than I deserved recognition. Judge Price faced the courtroom again. Captain Donovan stood against enormous pressure to bring the truth forward. No one laughed now. No one even moved. Across the room, Mark stared at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. His mother looked less certain than she had 20 minutes earlier. Then Judge Price said the sentence that changed everything. He turned toward Eleanor Whitaker and quietly said, "Mrs. Whitaker, your family name appears in that file." For several seconds, nobody spoke. The room felt suspended in place. A woman in the back lowered the notebook she had been writing in. Someone's chair creaked. The air conditioner hummed overhead. That was all. Eleanor recovered first. She straightened in her seat and forced a laugh. "This is ridiculous," she said. "My family had nothing to do with any military investigation." Judge Price looked at her for a long moment. Then he removed a folded document from a leather folder beside him. "I expected that response," he said quietly. The confidence vanished from Eleanor's face. Mark looked back and forth between us. "What is he talking about?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Judge Price opened the document. The Raven Ledger investigation involved defective communications equipment supplied to a military training facility. The room remained silent. The supplier was eventually linked to a subcontractor owned by Daniel Whitaker, Eleanor's younger brother. I watched the color drain from Mark's face. "What?" he whispered. Judge Price nodded. "The investigation found no evidence that Mrs. Whitaker committed a crime. However, the Whitaker family name appeared repeatedly throughout the proceedings." The attorney beside Eleanor suddenly looked very interested in the papers on his desk. He no longer seemed eager to speak. Then came the part I had never told anyone. Judge Price looked directly at Eleanor. "You knew who Captain Donovan was before she married into your family." The silence became absolute. Even Eleanor did not deny it immediately. That told everyone what they needed to know. Years of small insults suddenly looked different. Years of jokes. Years of dismissive comments. Years of pretending I was nothing more than a woman who filed paperwork. Mark slowly turned toward his mother. "You knew?" he asked. She swallowed. For the first time all morning, she looked afraid. "I didn't think it mattered." The words sounded weak even to her. A champagne glass could have shattered in the room and it would not have sounded louder. I finally spoke. My voice was calm. I was never hiding my past. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. "You were afraid of what it meant." Judge Price closed the file. The sound echoed through the courtroom. Across the room, people who had laughed earlier avoided looking at Eleanor. For the first time that day, she had no audience left. And for the first time in years, the truth belonged to the room instead of the rumor. The consequences were only beginning. The hearing ended differently than Eleanor had imagined. Her attorney requested a recess. The judge denied it. 20 minutes later, Eleanor formally withdrew several of the accusations she had made against me. The record would show that her claims could not be supported. For years, she had controlled family conversations. That day, facts controlled the room. As people began leaving, nobody gathered around Eleanor. Nobody rushed to comfort her. The same relatives who had nodded along with her earlier suddenly found reasons to look elsewhere. Truth has a way of changing the temperature of a room. I gathered my documents slowly and returned the Raven Ledger patch to my case. The hearing was over. The weight of 15 years felt lighter than it had that morning. "Claire," I turned. Mark was standing a few feet away. For the first time all day, his mother wasn't beside him. His shoulders seemed smaller somehow. "I should have said something years ago," he said. I looked at him quietly. There was a time when hearing those words would have meant everything. Not anymore. When she said those things about you, I knew they weren't true. The admission hurt more than I expected, not because it was new, because it confirmed what I had always suspected. You should have said one sentence, I replied. Mark lowered his eyes. I know. No, I said gently. I don't think you do. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to argue. Some wounds aren't caused by cruelty. They're caused by absence, by the people who watch and do nothing. A few moments later, Judge Price approached. The crowd instinctively moved aside for him. He stopped in front of me and extended his hand. Captain Donovan! It had been years since anyone called me that. For a second, I was 29 again, standing in uniform, believing that truth mattered enough to fight for. I shook his hand. Thank you, Judge, he smiled. No, Captain. Thank you. After he walked away, I stepped outside the courthouse. The afternoon sun felt warm against my face. Behind me, people were still talking. Ahead of me was silence, not the lonely silence I had lived with during my marriage. A different kind. The kind that comes when you no longer need permission to be yourself. Peace did not feel loud. It felt like finally not having to prove I existed. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know which moment affected you the most. Was it the silence in the courtroom, the hidden truth finally being revealed, or the realization that sometimes the deepest betrayal comes from the people who say nothing at all? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Stories like this remind us that dignity isn't about winning arguments. It's about standing in the truth, even when nobody stands beside you. If this story moved you, please like the video and subscribe for more stories about honor, courage, resilience, and quiet justice. Thank you for spending your time with us, and I'll see you in the next story. One of the most valuable lessons in life is that you do not need everyone to understand your journey for it to matter. Sometimes, the people closest to you may doubt your worth, overlook your sacrifices, or misunderstand your silence. But your value is not determined by their recognition. True strength comes from knowing who you are, standing by your principles, and letting your actions speak when words fail. In time, truth has a way of finding the light. If this message resonated with you, leave a comment and share the lesson that life has taught you. And if you enjoy stories about honor, resilience, dignity, and quiet strength, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. Your support means more than you know.